So welcome everyone. Welcome to an introduction for developers. As Sean mentioned, hope you're at the right place, and that's the event you were looking for. I'm not at the right place. It's definitely not my face on that side, but it's fine. We'll do it anyway. So yeah, today we'll do an introduction for developers. If you're using Postman, if you're doing anything with APIs, this should give you an overview of kind of the basics of getting started with Postman. And that's about it. Do you want to move on to the next slide?
Sure.
So my name's Arlemi. I'm a developer advocate at Postman based in the UK. I'm filling in for Claire, who might still join a bit later. And I'm here with Sean, who's going to introduce himself.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Sean Keegan. I am also a developer advocate here at Postman. I'm based in New York City. All right. Here we go.
So yeah, today's agenda. 5 more points, a couple of them Sean already mentioned, but we'll start with getting an introduction to Postman in general. We just want to make sure that everyone is on the same page, so we don't leave anyone behind. We'll see what is Postman. Postman's an API client, or studied as an API can evolved a lot, and it covers tons of things. So we want to make sure that you kind of see the big picture. We'll have a look at navigating authorization. Whenever you use APIs, you might have seen that a lot of time, authorization is your first blocker. Is how do I get past this not logged in or can't access that API error? And then we'll before you get out of that webinar, we'll give you a few resources so you can do a bit more learning at home, or if you want to learn more. And at the end, we'll do a Q&A. But with that, I think we have Claire back. So let's welcome Claire, and let's give it back to Sean for the next slide.
Yeah. Hey, Claire, how are you?
Hey, sorry for the drama. I'm here. Good to see you.
No worries at all. I will go back one quick slide so you can do a quick introduction for yourself. Arlemi has introduced himself, but yeah, if you want to do a quick intro so folks know who's going to be teaching them today.
Sure. I'm Claire, and I'm a student community manager here at Postman. Our team aims to promote API literacy in the classroom, and we're really excited that all of you are here to learn how to empower yourself with Postman today. And yeah, I'm excited to see there's over 100 of you here.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Claire. Glad to have you. All right, so we just covered the agenda. So I actually, before we get started into the actual teaching portion of the class, we want to do a quick poll. And so just ask, how familiar are you with Postman? And 2, how much experience do you have as a developer? And so I'm going to launch the poll now. Hopefully you're seeing it. So go ahead and answer. And any answer is fine. If you're not a developer and you just wanted to check out this session, that is totally fine. If you're new to Postman, also great. Like, this is what we're trying to understand is who's coming to these sessions so that we can tailor the material accordingly. Claire laughed at me when I said, when I put in the I don't identify as a developer phrasing. So I thought it was kind of funny, but yeah, this is awesome. I'm seeing the results pop in, and thanks. A lot of you are filling up. I'll give it another like 15 seconds here. Yeah, this is awesome. This is actually, I think, some of the best poll participation we've seen, Claire. I think
yeah,
85% of people have answered.
And wow, a lot of them don't identify as a developer. So
I know.
Fun one.
Cool. All right, I'm going to end the poll here so we can talk about the results real quick. Awesome. So yeah, I'll share the results so y'all can see. And so it's actually a pretty interesting split. So about 25% of you have said Postman is brand new to you, which is great. Like, part of what we're going to cover today is what is Postman, how to use it, and why to use it. So you're in the right place if that's where you are. Similarly, there's a lot, almost half the folks said that you've used Postman a few times, you can do some basic things. And then about a quarter of you have said you are either a power user or familiar with most features. So that's pretty cool. I like that we have a nice range. I'm excited for the folks that are brand new, because I think you'll really learn a lot about what you can do in Postman. And then how much experience do you have as a developer? So a quarter of the folks in here don't identify as a developer. Awesome. You're still going to learn a ton. This is a great session. And then the results are pretty split after that. Some fairly new developers with less than a year of experience. And this is actually interesting as well. A quarter of you have 6+ years of development experience. So I think it's pretty cool just to always see who's in the room with us. So thanks all for sharing. I'm going to stop this for now and then keep going to the next slide. So Claire, now we know our audience. So we're ready to tailor the lesson on the fly here?
Absolutely.
Cool. All right, so these are the learning objectives. So based on who's here, some of these might be brand new to you, some of these might be things you've already seen before, but this is what we're going to cover today. First, just how to send an API request in Postman. That's like kind of the basic what Postman started as, right? Sending an API request and getting something back. Along with that, we'll use Postman as an API client to inspect and test a response. We'll set and get variables. So if you're a developer, this is probably something that you're at least accustomed to seeing, is this idea of variables, and we'll see how to use them in Postman. Saving example responses to a collection. So that might not mean much to you right now, but you'll see kind of what that means and how that's valuable in a little bit. Navigating different types of authorization. So this is something Arlemy touched on. This is often the first blocking point or challenging point when working with an API is, how the heck do I get my information to them so they know it's me and know that it's like a valid person requesting it? And then the last thing we'll talk about is just debugging and troubleshooting unexpected API behavior. So how to get yourself out of a jam if you're having trouble making a successful request. So that's the goal when you leave today. Hopefully you know how to do all those. And if you don't, or something wasn't clear, these sessions are recorded so you can watch it again later and follow along at your own pace. Cool. So I think before we go into Claire showing us how to do all this stuff, I wanted to just quickly introduce what Postman is, because we do have 25% of our audience saying Postman is brand new to them. And so by definition, Postman is an API collaboration platform, and it's used by more than 17 million users. So quite a big group of people using Postman. And if I had to summarize it in a sentence, this is kind of what I like to think about with Postman is it helps people work with APIs more efficiently. And you can see we have this flywheel over here that talks about all of the, or not even all, but like a lot of the different parts of the API lifecycle that Postman helps you navigate. And so we're not going to get into a ton of these today, but we'll get a good foundational understanding of what you can do with Postman today. And as you get more familiar with it, you can go on to some of the other features that we have available. All right. And from here, I think that's enough talking from myself and from Arlemy. So we'll go ahead and transition to the kind of hands-on portion of the lesson. And this is where we truly encourage you to follow along. We've created a collection in Postman, and Claire will talk about kind of what that means. But yeah, there's an opportunity for you to follow along. And Arlemy, if you could drop this link in the chat for folks, that would be super helpful. And Claire's going to kind of show you exactly what to do. And from here, I'm going to transition to Claire teaching you all.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Arlemy, for sharing the link in the chat. Hopefully you can all see my screen, and this is where that link will take you. Before we go any further, I know Sean and I have been saying the word API over and over again, but since over a quarter of us are not developers or have been developing less than a year, just a quick intro on what that is. You can think of an API like a waiter at a restaurant. So let's say you, the client, you don't know how to make cheesecake, but you want to eat cheesecake. So you go to the restaurant and you ask the waiter for cheesecake. You place an order. And the waiter takes that to the chef in the back kitchen. Their specialty is making cheesecakes, and they send a cheesecake back to you. And the API is the exact same concept. We have this simplified interface for talking with the back kitchen or a server someplace. So instead of asking for cheesecake, you can ask for data. And this gives you a lot of power either as a developer for making integrations with other services and applications, or if you're not a developer, like if you're in marketing or if you're a product manager or something, you can use APIs to fetch data to integrate with your analytics, etc. So everything we're talking about today is going to be applicable to you in some way or another. And Postman is going to make your life much easier in working with APIs. So if you've clicked the link and if you have a Postman account, you'll be seeing a screen like mine right now. And the first thing you have to know with Postman, well, A, you can use this tool in the browser for free. We didn't have to download anything, and we're already in the tool. And everything that happens in Postman happens out of a workspace. So here we are in the Postman Spacecamp workspace. It's a public workspace, you can see with the globe here. And there's a bunch of collections in here. This list here, each of these collections is a folder that contains a bunch of requests that we would make to an API, like our orders for the cheesecake. And we've organized the requests into some folders. Today, we're doing the Introduction for Developers collection here. So you can go ahead and click to expand that. And you'll see there's a bunch of folders in here. They're probably not open for you. Let me close these. And each folder has a bunch of requests. So in order to work with a collection, like we can view it from this link, but if we want to like edit it and send requests and play around with it, we have to make our own copy. And we do that by creating a fork. Fork is just a fancy word for a copy. So you can find the 3 dots next to the collection, click there, and scroll down and look for create a fork. All right. Now it's going to let you give like a special unique name for your fork. I'm just going to give it my name and the date, which is the 11th. Nope, the 12th. But you can name it whatever you want. And then it's going to ask you, where do you want to make this fork or this copy? Now, I've made a workspace in advance called Spacecamp Demo. But if you're new to Postman, maybe you don't have any custom workspace yet, you definitely have one called My Workspace, and you can fork it there. I'm going to fork mine to Spacecamp Demo and click Fork Collection. And this is going to just take that whole folder or collection and copy it to the workspace that we specified. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can all see. All right. So now we're in our workspace, Spacecamp Demo, or My Workspace for you, and we have a copy. So let's get our bearings real quick before we go on. This is our little navigation panel where you can, explore our collection. And then if we click on the folder, sending requests and inspecting responses, it's going to open up the folder and we can see all of our requests inside. One thing to note about Postman is if you click on anything like a collection or a folder or a request, there's a little file icon on the far right that's going to have any documentation that's associated with that entity. You can open and close the documentation by clicking on the little icon. And there's a bunch of text in here. If you were doing this by yourself, you could run through this slowly and do it at your pace. So don't worry if you get lost on the demo today, you can always come back and do this. We're going to be talking through this, so you don't have to do a lot of reading today. All right, so we talked about making that cheesecake order at the restaurant. Let's try doing that in the context of a real API. So we have what's called the library API here at Postman to practice making API requests. Let's go ahead and click on the first request that says get books. And now we have a new view over here. You'll notice in Postman, everything is presented in tabs. So you can have multiple requests open at once. And then this next part with the bar and the button that says send is very important. This is where we build our requests. So here on the far left, there's a drop-down menu that has a bunch of different methods. So with APIs, there's different types of requests that you can make. A GET request is when we want to fetch data from a server. We aren't changing anything over there. There's other types like post, put, patch, delete. These all have to do with modifying data in a database on a server somewhere. We'll get to those, but just for the first example, we'll make a fetch GET request. And then here we have our URL, our request URL. So we need a method and a place to make the request to. And the request URL is our place to make the request. This URL has kind of 2 parts. So the part all the way up to api.glitch.me right here, this is the host server. So somewhere out on the internet, we have coded a server that's listening and waiting for requests. And this is the address of that server. On that server, we have a couple of routes that can be specified with paths. So everything after the slash becomes the path. We call this also the endpoint in our API. So here we are on the API library API on the path /books, and we're making a GET request. all we have to do now is to click send. And you can see we're getting in the lower half of the screen, Postman is going to show the response from the server. So we ordered our cheesecake and it came back from the kitchen, and this is what we see. Postman is nice because, this is just data that we're getting back from the server. Postman's helped us by coloring and indenting it, so it's very easy to read. Depending on the API, you're going to get back different types of data. This API sends us back JSON data. If you're not familiar with that, it's just JavaScript object notation. We have an array or a list of objects. That's what these curly braces are. And each object represents a book. So we see here we have 100 Years of Solitude is the first book. You can see who the author is. Each book has an ID. It's a unique identifier for the book, and some more data about the book. You can see there's a bunch of books in this library. And another thing to notice here, you can see we also get something called a status code back from the API. And here we have a status 200, which means a success. So there's kind of a language in HTTP of codes, kind of like police codes that represent certain, statuses of your response. You don't have to memorize these codes at all in Postman. It's a great way to learn what these mean, because you can just hover on it and it's going to give you a description of what that means. And a bunch of other data, like how long it took to go there and back and how big the response was. Okay, so why is this important? If you wanted to integrate some application you're building with an API, now you know first how to make the request, where to make it, and then what types of data come back. So you could map it into your application however you want, or your analytics. So this is the example of the most basic, GET request we can make, but there's more we can do in Postman. So I'm going to go to the second one here, called GET book. And we notice it's a similar URL. We're making a GET request here. The path is different now. It's get/books/:ID. And this colon is kind of a wild card, meaning we can have a dynamic part of our path here that represents the ID of a book. So we can go ahead and in our previous request to get all the books in the library, I'm just going to copy the ID of this 100 Years of Solitude and head back to our get book request. And I'm going to replace the colon ID with the ID of our book and click send. And now, instead of all the books in the library, we're just getting that one book back. And it has the same ID, of course. Now, if you were sharing this request with somebody on your team, they might look at this and say, hey, I don't know what this gobbledygook is here. One way that we can communicate to ourselves, our future selves, and our teammate better is to keep that colon ID here. And when I was typing that, you'll see Postman added this path variables table down here. So it's a way we can kind of nickname stuff in our path, make it easier to read. I'm just going to paste that same ID right here as the value for the key called ID and send. And you'll see we're making the exact same request as before. It's just more human friendly to read now. All right, so hope you're following along so far. Let's see what else we can do. This API allows us not only to retrieve data, but to send data and add it to the database of books. So up until now, we've been making what's called a GET request. And if we want to send data to an API, typically we make what's called a POST request. If you're posting something to Twitter, you're adding data to their servers, or posting to Facebook, you can remember it that way. So we're changing our method from GET to POST. And you'll notice we're using the exact same path /books that we are using to get all the books. But instead of a GET request, since we're making a POST request, we're doing a different operation. So this is where I'm going to introduce something called the body. We can add this extra payload information to an API request when we're sending data. And here Postman tells you, you can send many different types of data. Maybe you have like an HTML form on your web page and you want to simulate sending that. You can send a file. Maybe you want to send an image. you can send what's called a GraphQL query. You can make a query or mutation to a GraphQL server. There's all types of requests you can make. We're going to make a raw JSON body because that's what this API is expecting. And if you ever want to walk through the documentation for this API on your own, there is a link in the documentation. This is how we know what type of requests we're making. But the documentation told us, hey, if you want to add a book, you need to have this body in your request that has a title, author, genre, and year published. And there's an example here. So if you're following along, feel free to replace this with any book that you've read recently. Like, for example, I just read this book called Silence by Endo Shusaku. It's a fiction book, and I don't know when it's published. Let's just say 1950. And if I click send, it's going to go off, and we get this little message back from the server that says, okay. Also, status 201 means like a thumbs up. We've created a resource on the server. But how do we know that anything has changed? We can go back to our books request here, hit send. And I see a lot of you have been posting some books. I see there's a Murakami book here. Mine's probably sunk down way lower. Oh man, all of you put a bunch in there. There, mine's like the 7th or 8th one down there. So this is a real server out there. That's why we can see all of the books that you have added, which is awesome. And since we're librarians here, how are we going to check out a book and maybe change some data? Well, that's our next request. There's a method called patch that lets us usually edit data in an API's database. The request URL looks exactly like getting a book, a single book, but instead of a get, we're making a patch request. And this request needs a book ID. So we can put that, I can get the ID of my Silence book down here, right there. And I will paste it here in the path variables table so that ID resolves to RID and hit send. And we got a status 200, which is a success. So now if we were to go back and get a book, I can get that single Silence book by putting RID right there. And we can see the checked out value has changed from false to true, just like we said. I forgot to mention one thing real quick. When we made this patch request, we actually sent it with a body because the documentation said, hey, you have to tell us what you want to change. We wanted to change checked out property from false to true. So that's why when we sent this request, it updated the data. Lastly, it's important to know how to delete data. You change the method to delete. We have to tell it which book to delete. So for the ID, I'll just paste in my Silence book and hit send. And now we have a status 200. The book has been successfully deleted. What happens if you think I try to delete a book again that doesn't exist? Let's see. Now we're getting back a status 404 not found. Maybe you're familiar with that from cruising the web. That's when they can't find a web page. The API couldn't find the book that we had already deleted. So obviously our operations were working. So that was a bit of a slow intro there, Sean. We'll be picking it up to finish the rest of this, but do you have any comment to add here?
Yeah, I think that's a great intro. I think you covered some of the great basics of, just like Postman as an API client, right? So sending a request, checking out the response. One question that a few people did have in the Q&A that I think is worth talking about right now is the difference between a put request and a patch request. So yeah.
Yes. So you notice for our updating, we're making a patch request here. Put and patch are both methods for editing data conventionally. There's this word that I can't pronounce called idempotency. But basically, put is when you're replacing all of the data for an entry. For example, you're totally changing all of the contents of the book. Patch is when you're like partially updating the data. Here, we're only updating the checked out property, so the patch convention made sense. Great
Awesome.
question.
Yeah, I just saw like 2 people had asked that, and I figured this is a great time to talk about it. Cool. So yeah, I think this has been so far, right? Like that's kind of like the basics to Postman. I'd say if you're familiar with Postman, in any sense, right? Like, or you're used to like the basic usage, like this is probably what you've gotten up to. And so now we're going to move on to, I don't want to say advanced stuff per se, but, a little bit more, robust usage of Postman. So take it away, Claire. Let's get into some more. I think this is where stuff gets kind of exciting and kind of see, how valuable and useful Postman can be in testing APIs.
Sure. Yeah. So everything we've done so far, you could technically do from the terminal with a curl command. But Postman makes it nice because we could see all the request and response pieces and a pretty UI that's very easy to view. What's nice about Postman is you can do extra stuff, including writing tests. So let's see here. We've already done the get a book operation. We can try it again by seeing what books we have left in the library. It looks like somebody shared this one called The End of Imagination. So let's get that one. I'll copy its ID, get a book, and I'll paste the ID right here. And I'm going to send this off. So we're getting that book back. The difference is now you see there's a test results tab down here. We didn't have this before. The reason this is showing up is we've added a test script in our request in advance called in the test tab. And you'll see this little editor opens up when we click the test tab. In here, you can write Node.js code to execute script every time a response comes back from your request. And this is very handy for running automated tests of an API request. Here you see why we're getting the test results. We have this helper object in the Postman editor here called PM. And if you say PM dot, you'll see it comes with all of these special methods. One of them is the test method. And Postman uses the Chai and Mocha libraries under the hood to run tests programmatically. We have one here called status code is 200 to check and make sure that response that came back is 200. And you can see we just have pm.test, a title for a test, and then a callback function. So this is what it's actually checking for. It's saying we're expecting the response to have status 200. It reads exactly like English. So we can click on the test results tab here and see it says status code is 200 and it passes the test. The cool thing is you don't have to memorize all of the syntax, even though it does read very easily like English. We can delete all this. Postman has some snippets over here in the right that will let you just click to add tests. So this one where we were trying to check the status code 200 is here. I'll click it and it gets pasted right into the editor. Sean, are there any tests that you'd like to run?
Yeah, this is Claire. Would you mind zooming in maybe one time just as we're showing this snippet section? Cool. Yeah, I think so. Say we're looking at the library API and everyone's entering all these books and it's hard to like keep track of everything. One test snippet that I really like is the one you're kind of hovering over now. Is the response body contains string? Scroll up a tiny bit. Yeah. And what this does, right, is like Claire talked about before, when we get the response. In general, it's just this blob of text, right? So it's, Postman does format it and make it easy to find. But if there's 10,000 entries and we're trying to find a certain book, it can be pretty challenging to like scan through and see. So this allows you to kind of just make sure that somewhere in that response that you're going to get the string you want. So I really like this one.
Yeah, for example, with this particular request, we're expecting this type of object to come back, right? It has the author key in it. So we could, in our test here, say the body matches the string author. We can edit the message of our test. And this is the string that we want to search. Well, let's replace it with author. All right. And let's run our request again by hitting send, which will trigger our test script. So now you can see we have two tests and both of them are passing. Yes, it matches author. If we said we wanted it to match foo and hit send, it says that the second test is failing because there's no foo in our response. So this is very useful if you need to test your own API that you've built, or if you're expecting something and you don't want the human to have to check every time. Thanks, Sean, for pointing that one out. One more thing in this Books API, another nice feature of Postman is, especially if you're working on a team, you can save a snapshot of a response from a request and share it with your team members. So again, I'm just going to send off this /books request where we're getting all the books in the library. This is great. I had to click send though and wait for the server to get back the response. What you can do on any request is over on the right, there's a save response button. And I can click that and say save as an example or a file to your computer, but we're going to save an example. And when we did that, Postman created a little EG example on our request. And this is great because you can share different types of responses from an API. We're sharing, or excuse me, saving an example of a successful response with all of the data here. And you could use this to, mentally figure out how you're going to map this data into your application, or just to show new people to the API, hey, this is what type of data comes back. So it's a great collaboration feature, among other things. You can actually use these examples to just click a button on the mock servers over here and build a real fake server on Postman for the front-end team to practice hitting a fake backend with real data. So Sean, is there anything else about examples that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think so. Another thing that I find valuable, right? If I'm just trying to explore an API without making a bunch of calls myself, you can kind of explain what some of the behavior might look like. In this case, we see what a successful 200 OK request would look like. Say the server was down or something, you can save an example for different types of responses, even if it's the same exact request. So, right, if this for some reason returned, or like we were searching for a specific book and it was successful, we would see our 200 for that. But if the book wasn't in the library, we could save an example for what it looks like when a book is not returned as well. And so just kind of outlining some of the behavior of the library is pretty valuable.
Yes, and to that point, you can rename your examples too, like say, hey, this is an example of a 200 request. And then if you, let's say we made a mistake in the URL, books, you can see this is like a 404 example. We could save that as well here. So you can show multiple different types of responses. And now anybody in your team can have an example of what comes back. This is very helpful for teams that need to code responses for errors. And again, it's great for mock servers as well. Great, let's keep chugging along. I'm gonna close these folders. All right, so one of the most powerful features in Postman is the ability to use variables. It lets you keep your collections dry, do not repeat yourself. It also lets you programmatically create workflows, dynamically setting values. So we're going to go ahead and get all these books again, as we've done many times. This is a great one, Blah Blah by Mr. Blah. And what we're going to do is try to programmatically get the ID of this first book, whatever the first book is that comes back, so that we can use it in a subsequent request. Now, there's many scopes to save a variable in Postman. We have the collection level variable, which is going to be a variable saved at our collection. That means you can access it anywhere inside your collection. We also have environment variables, which you can share between multiple collections. There's global variables as well that are everywhere inside of your Postman workspace. But we're going to just, instead of manually copying and pasting this, use those handy dandy test scripts that we talked about earlier to set the variable. So on the test tab of our request, you can see right now there's just a script that's saying console log our pm.response.json. Remember, PM is the Postman helper. Response is an object representing the response from our API, and JSON is how we convert it into JSON data. So if I hit send, it's going to trigger the script, but where is it being logged? We can check the Postman console in the lower left, and you can see this whole time we've been making requests, it's been logging each of the requests we make, and also any data that we've said console log. So that's what this is down here. We see we have 59 books in the library, and I can expand it now. You can see the first one here is The End of Imagination. This is what we're trying to get. The first book, to save it. So just like we would with any JavaScript object, I can define a new variable by saying const ID equals, and we can say PM dot response to get our response. We'll convert it into JSON with .json. So now we're here. We have this array of 59 books. We just want the first one. So I'll get the index 0 book. And inside that book, we want the property called ID. So I'll say .id here. So I have that ID now stored to a variable. And to prove it, we can log the ID and send. And we're getting a string here. So how do we save that to use it in our next request? We can save it as a collection variable. So we can access it anywhere in our collection. And to do that, we again use the Postman helper. So PM dot collection variables. And this has two methods, a getter and a setter method. So we can say dot set, which is a method that takes two parameters. The first is the name of a variable. We can call it whatever we want. Let's just call it ID. And then the value. And the value is going to be our variable ID here.
So Claire,
yeah,
can I ask you to show one thing just so people believe that this actually did what it was supposed to do?
Yeah.
Can you just show where we would find collection variables now and show that we don't have any, and then watch what happens when we do set this?
Yes. Okay. Good point. So here is our collection, our top level folder, right? This is where your collection variables live over in the variables tab. I'm going to make a little real estate here. You can see right now we have nothing in this table. But if we return to our request, save book ID, in our test script tab, now we've coded it to take that first ID and save it as a collection variable called ID. So when I hit send, it's going to trigger our test script on the response. And now if we go back, look at the collection variables, bam, we have a variable called ID, and its current value is set to the first book in our array. You'll notice there's two columns, initial value and current value. What's the difference? Postman is always going to resolve your variable to whatever is in the current value column. Initial value is the default value for your variable. And this is important if you want to share your requests with teammates or with the public internet. But most of the time, or not always, do you want to share the values of your variables. Sometimes you have API keys. Sometimes you have secrets that you don't want to share. And if you have anything you don't want to share, only put it in the current value column. If you do want to share stuff with the public, you can put it in the initial value column as well as the current value column. And happy to answer any questions about that later too. All right, so now we have this ID variable on our collection, and we can use it anywhere. So in our next request called getBookFromID variable, you can see there's some funky stuff happening in our URL. This double curly syntax is how we interpolate variables in Postman. And you'll see there's one called base URL here that's replacing what we had up here, this part, right? Up until now, we've been hard coding this same URL over and over again. That's the location of our server. But since we're repeating it every time, we can also save it as a variable called base URL. So this has already been done for us, but I'll show you another way you can set a variable by getting rid of this. And I'll paste that hard-coded URL again. You can highlight this whole string, and you'll see Postman pops up with a set as variable helper. So this is another way to manually set a variable. And you see it shows us all of our existing variables, but we want a new one. And we'll call it base URL. And it's going to have the value we just had. And then we choose a scope. We want to set it at the collection level, so we can access the base URL anywhere in our collection. All right, and say set variable. And bam. You can see now if I hover on this base URL, it's resolving to the value here. And if you don't believe me, we can check the collection, check the variables tab, get rid of all this, and you see we have our base URL saved here. Same for the ID. We set this in the previous request, and you'll see this looks familiar, this one that starts with W here. This is the programmatically set variable from before. So now if I send this off, Hopefully nobody deleted that book. And you'll see we're getting back the end of imagination in our response. So this is a great way to build automated workflows if you need to chain a couple of API requests or anything dynamic in your work with APIs, and to keep yourself dry. All right, we have a couple of minutes left. I just want to show you one last important feature that if you're a developer, especially, this is going to come in handy. Up until now, we've been using APIs or an API that it's totally open to the public. You don't need any password, any API key to use it. However, as many of you know, if you want to do anything cool with APIs, usually you have to authorize your request in some way to prove you are who you say you are and that you have access to some data. So let's do an example of that using GitHub. GitHub as an API that is open to the public, but if you authorize your request, you can do some extra stuff. So for example, their API is api.github.com/user. I can look up myself here. My username is Clairefro. So if I go off and send this, oops, actually it's users/username. I'll go ahead and send this. And you can see there's some data about me here, location, how many repos I have, etc. This is the public view of my account. Now, if I want to get all of my repos, I can change this to users/Clairefro/repos and send. And you can see this is data about all my repos. So, okay, we've done everything public so far. But let's say I want to get some private data. What I can do is add authorization. And the only reason I know how to do this is because GitHub's API docs told me I could. So I'll give you the shortcut and just show you how to do it. Postman gives you these helpers to use different types of authorization on your request. And you'll see there's one called API key, basic auth, OAuth 2, all of these many types of auth that you might see on an API. GitHub has several ways we can do it. One of them is basic auth. And we could do it here just by adding the username and password for using this API. But I want to show you one other cool thing you can do with Postman is instead of at the request level, you can set your authorization at any level, at the folder level or the collection level. You'll see they all have an authorization tab. Since we have 2 GitHub requests in this folder, I'm just going to go ahead and authorize at the folder level. So I'll select here basic auth. And in here, I'll put the username Clairefro. And for the GitHub API, your password is going to be a personal access token. So not your GitHub password, but it's a token you can set up in your developer settings in GitHub. I've already made one, so I'll just paste it in here. And now, if I save this with Command S, this authorization is going to apply to every single request in our folder, so long as the authorization for each request is set to inherit auth from parent. So remember, this was the data we got the first time around. We had like 34 lines of response code. Now, since I'm sending it authorized as myself, let's see what happens. All right, so now we're getting back more data. We have 46 lines, and you can see like stuff that's private. You can see all of my private repos, some other stuff that maybe I shouldn't be sharing, but you can see we're getting a specialized view based on our authorization. And so now you know how Postman can help you with this. Maybe if you're a developer, you're familiar with the pains of working with OAuth. Postman makes that super easy for APIs that use OAuth. You just fill out all of these forms and click the big orange button, and it's going to do the whole OAuth dance for you, so you can poke around with APIs without the hassle. All right, I know we're really running low on time, so I'm just going to whiz through the very last section here. And debugging and troubleshooting. As developers especially are aware that debugging is an important skill to have in any tool. Postman aims to help you here. We've already shown this console down here. which is going to give you debug information about every request you've made. So you can really drill down and see exactly what headers were sent, what response headers came back, the response body. You can see what the request URL resolved to if you had any variables. That's one way to debug. But like we shown in our test tab earlier, we also have a tab for writing script called the pre-request script, which we'll introduce here. And this works exactly like the test tab. The only difference is the timing of when this one is fired. While the test script is run after your response comes back, pre-request, like the name indicates, is run right before your request is sent. So we're just going to show an example of some of the stuff you can do with this one. Any of those JavaScript, console.warn.log.info.err, you can use here as well. So we'll hit send. And I'll scroll to the bottom of our console here in the lower left. And Postman colors the warning and the info and error accordingly. So you can use any debugging tactics that you would in your normal Node applications here. And remember, you can always console log your PM request or response or anything you want to take a look at. So that was the whirlwind tour of Postman for developers, and I do want to save time for Q&A and Sean's closing. So thank you.
Claire, that was awesome. Super, I think super helpful. Folks, we will have some time for other questions that come up. And so I'm just going to share my screen again here and just go over briefly some of the learning objectives that the goal was that you'd be able to walk away with today. So we sent an API request in Postman. We did that many times. Used Postman as an API client to inspect and test the response. So that's where we saw the response body come back. Claire used some snippets, wrote some custom tests, set and get variables. We saw that with changing the URL and then using the book ID to make sure that we could use information from one request to the next one. Saving example responses to a collection. That was where we, saved all the books so that we had something to look back on if we were just trying to explore what the response looked like. We talked about different types of responses as well. Navigating different types of authorization. So we went through that a little bit quickly, and we could do a 3-hour webinar on authorization alone. So Claire gave a great idea of or great intro to some authorization for the GitHub API. And there's tons more, but that was just a nice, sneak peek. And then just going through some of the ways you can debug and troubleshoot, different ways you can log messages and take a look at what's going on. So hopefully you learned all those. If you didn't, feel free to watch the video when it's available on demand and, go through again at your own time. So next I want to talk about some additional resources. So hopefully Arlamy and Vikram can drop these links in for folks. Postman Space Camp, this is the workspace that we're at with, it's got links to all the other sessions that we've done so far. And so that's a great resource. Everything's documented with videos on demand. 30 Days of Postman for Developers. This is a great learning resource. There are 30 collections with a specific focus for each one. It says 30 days, you can knock it out in a few days if you want, go at your own pace. But I think that is a workspace and a challenge that's very appropriate given what we covered today for folks in here. Community forum. All of us are active on the community forum. It's a great place to go to ask questions that may have not gotten answered today. If you want to show something off that you've done with Postman, or just kind of stay aware of what's going on in the Postman world, upcoming events and stuff like that, great place to go. And the last one is Postman Answers. It's another public workspace. So similar to the Space Camp public workspace, it's just got plenty of the most common questions that were asked on the community forum, with a collection showing you exactly how to do the things it's asking. So, if you want to loop through a data file, right, there's an answer for that in that workspace. And it just kind of gives you actual code for going through, some of the most popular questions. And with that, we did great on time. We left some time for Q&A. So we have plenty of time. Kudos to Arlamy and Vikram behind the scenes. They've answered a lot of your questions already. But we'll go through now and kind of just look at some of the ones that are available on here. So I see one from Swahari. Oh, well, Arlene just answered it. So I will answer another open one here. Any blog posts for automating OAuth 2.0 login? So he doesn't have to do it manually each time. This is from Roshan. I believe there are resources and information on this process. If I remember correctly, I think Alan Helton might have written something in terms of like refreshing tokens to handle this. So
have a video lesson of how to do it with the Spotify API as an example. So I'm happy to share that. I'm going to grab it.
Cool. Yeah, if you could drop that in the link for Roshan, that'd be great. So Roshan, it might not be specific to the Google one, but a lot of the same principles I imagine will apply. Another question that came through was, can you see who added or posted new information? And so Arlen, we did answer this, but if you were looking at the library API, right, we didn't know who entered which books in the library. And that's just the design of that particular API. If the API had some sort of authentication, so like GitHub, right? If we were to create a repo or create something, that was public in GitHub, you would have to do it as an authenticated user, and there would be some record of who created the put or patch entry. So it really depends on the API and the design of the API. Let's see, other ones that make sense. Okay, so there were a few questions kind of asking about testing and how to go about tests. So this one from Usman is asking, is there a way to have a regex to assert a particular field value, such as a date pattern? And there's another one, I just want to kind of hit both of these at the same time. It asked, I'm looking for it. Okay, does it only support Node.js or any other languages as well, like Junet, Mockito? So testing, we did some very basic tests in our examples today. But so under the hood or built in, the Postman sandbox supports Chai.js. And so you can use that for testing assertions. And there are other libraries available. There's, I think, Moment for formatting dates and stuff like that. If you wanted to use regexes to find certain things, you can. Otherwise, it does support general JavaScript. Want to add anything there, Claire?
Yeah, you can, even if you don't know the Chai syntax for writing a test, you can always use any condition statement in JavaScript and expect it to be true or false as well. So if you know how to use regex with like a dot match, you can just expect that condition to be true, and it's the exact same thing. I believe there is a string matching in Chai, and there's one in the snippets if you'd like to check that out.
Yeah. So we have another question that's open. Is there a way to bookmark the Spacecamp and 30 Days collection in Postman for easy access, similar to starring a repo on GitHub? I love this question. So I'm still sharing my screen here, and I'll show you one thing that you can do. If I'm in a workspace that has, so not in the same way that you can on GitHub, but what you can do is if I'm in, let's say I'm in this workspace here, and I'll zoom in so y'all can see better. We do have the ability to, say you have 100 collections in your workspace, you can star a specific collection and that will automatically bring it up to the top. So I'm going to unstar this one, and you find this just by like hovering over it, finding this little star icon. And at the very least, this will put it up towards the top in my own personal workspace. So that's one way, just make it a little bit easier to find it.
You can always use your browser bookmarks as well.
Yes, yeah, that's what I have. All the cool public workspaces that I want to find in there. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Let's see, that was answered live. Look and see, Claire, is there any that you are thinking we should definitely ask or answer this one?
I saw a couple in our private channel here, like about supporting GraphQL, etc. Did we cover those in the chat already, or?
Yeah, that's a great one. No, let's talk about that. So yeah, somebody asked, I think, does Postman support GraphQL? And, a one-word answer is yes. We often, I think, show REST APIs, but yes, Postman does support GraphQL as well. And
I'll just
Claire's gonna.
quickly, yeah, we've been making like JSON requests in the body of our request. You can just change that to GraphQL. And if you're using a GraphQL API, you would make a post request so that you're posting your query, and you would just type in your query invitation here. And you can even use variables. So don't worry if you don't know GraphQL. This is just for the people that do. Know that you can definitely use it with Postman.
Sweet. All right. And I think that's all for all the time we have for questions today. So I want to make sure that I share our upcoming session. So give me one sec here. Am I sharing the right screen, Claire? Am I seeing Postman Space Camp?
Yep.
Cool. So hopefully, Arleme and Vikram can drop in links to this Postman homepage. We have 2 sessions coming up, one in February and one in March. So the February one is working with your team in Postman. And this is a great way, this session will talk about just different ways to collaborate. It'll talk about, quite a few different things. It's hard to, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but, using some integrations that will allow you to collaborate with your team, such as using Git. And yeah, so I think that'll be a cool one. And then coming March, we have Postman, an introduction for testers. And this is another great session. If you were interested at all in what Claire was doing in those tests tab, that God, I always stumble on that one. But yeah, right. So we did some very basic testing. This will be a great introduction and dive a bit deeper on some other things you can do with testing, some best practices, writing custom tests, and so forth. So highly recommend that if you were, if your interest was piqued by some of those code snippets and testing. And then the very last thing, like we said at the beginning, this is very much a process where we're taking feedback from what you enjoyed and what you learned about the session and using that to inform us going forward. So if you wouldn't mind, we have a very short survey. If you go to this link here, again, hopefully someone can drop it in the chat. It's, I think it's 4 or 5 questions, but it really does, help us figure out what the best thing to do going forward for these sessions is. So that would be super helpful. And I think we did it, Claire, right on time. Cool. All right.
Well done.
Woo. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming to Space Camp. See you next month at our collaboration session. And yeah, thanks so much. Have a good one.
Happy APIing.